going to be talking about this particular approach to the participatory explanation of alternative futures. The reference to civil society that I'll be making is limited to the fact that the last major exercise, one of the last major exercises that I helped people carry out was with the International Center for Civil Society in Berlin. And that exercise took place last year. And Annette has shared with you a report produced by that organization, plus a link to the actual Parivo exercise. And that was the main reason for the reference to that particular, to civil society, was that here you can see, you can actually explore an actual completed exercise and you can see the write-up of it. So I'm not going to say much more about that exercise as such. It's just a resource there for you to explore. The other thing is the connection between this and advocacy. I think there's a lot of potential for the use of this tool for advocacy purposes, and I'll come on to that in the last slide of this presentation. So with that, I think I'll just start with what I've got in front of me, which is, and I'm just going to walk you through what this web app is all about. Its origins lie in my PhD fieldwork in Bangladesh in the 1990s, when I was doing research on organizational learning in NGOs. And there was one paragraph in the last chapter of my PhD thesis which described the idea which is embodied in this app. So basically, Parivo is a web app. It's designed to enable a participatory explanation of alternative futures. And when you when you go to this web address, this is what you'll see. Basically a front page where there's a bit of an explanation of what it's all about on the left. If you want to start up a Parivo exercise and run one, you apply to be a facilitator in the middle there. And then there's a few obligatory things about privacy, limitation of liability, and copyright on the right-hand side. But once you've actually logged on and become a facilitator, for example, sorry, I need to move this. Did you see that screen or not? I'm not sure what screen you're watching at the moment.
Yeah, Rick, so my guess is you were explaining this slide for the last couple minutes, but
yeah,
this
my
slide
apologies.
was not the one that was up.
Yes, it's a problem of working from two screens. I should be working from the wrong screen. So basically, yes, this is what you would see when you go to the website. The explanation of the app here on the right, on the left, where you sign up to become a facilitator of a Parivo exercise, and some information about privacy, liability, and copyright on the right. So having done that, there is also a second website, and this is the address of a second website, which gives a whole lot of background information on how the app works. It's very detailed, so it's like an extensive set of help pages. So you've got two pages, this one here, this site here, parivo.org, and then the second one here. And in this slide, I'm just going to describe basically how the process works. So if we look on this diagram on the right-hand side, here we have what I call a seed paragraph. It's like the first page of a novel. And this is usually set up by the exercise designer, the facilitator of the exercise. And in this exercise, we had 10 participants who are each then invited to write the next page of that novel, so to speak. In fact, not a next page, it's more like a next paragraph. And so they each write an alternative paragraph to what happens next. They don't see what each other are writing, and it's anonymous. Mm-hmm. And when they've done that, everybody can then view what has been written, and then they are invited to do the same, but to build put another paragraph on one only of those paragraphs that are there. So basically, we've got 10 alternative versions of the story here. And in the next iteration, some people, nobody decides to add to these two branches, but over here, 2 people decide to add to these 2 branches, 2 decide to add to these branches. And again, at the end of that iteration, everybody can see the storyline that's developing and are invited to add another contribution. And here you can see there's one storyline where 3 people want to add to it. Over here, there are just single people developing them. Again, there are some storylines which nobody is adding to, and that storyline is effectively dying out. So basically what we've got is a tree structure of narratives. some branches grow, some die out, some grow so actively that they develop multiple sub-branches. And this is all basically a social implementation of what's called the evolutionary algorithm, the reiteration of variation, selection, and retention. So this is the core part of the whole PowerEvo app. It's about development of alternative storylines incrementally and collaboratively by the participants anonymously. Sorry. And I'll see if I can move this on. So this is the user interface. So that was just a schematic description, but here's what you would actually see if you're a participant on the website. So at the top here is the instructions that the facilitator is given.
Selling is out. This business is selling.
At the top here is instructions given by the facilitator about how the participants need to interact with this site here. Here we've seen the first paragraph in one storyline, and over here is a diagram of how all the paragraphs are connected. This green line here is just one selected storyline, and that's what you can see down here. If we were to click on any one of these other nodes, the text would change and you'd be able to read that storyline. You'll see also there's a facility to add a comment under each of the paragraphs, which is an optional part there. There's a search function where you can search the storylines for different content. There's an image up here just trying to lighten up the text with a bit of a symbolic sort of imagery of what the exercise is all about. And down the bottom, we've got what I call an evaluation widget, one of a number of methods whereby people evaluate the content of the storylines. So basically on this interface, we've got the facilitator's guidance, the seed text, the contributions, the whole storylines, the tree structure itself, which is like a macro view, some evaluation judgments, and there are basically a couple of core roles here. One is the facilitator who designs the whole exercise and the participants who contribute and write the storylines, but we can also have commentators and observers as well. And in the background is myself as the administrative support, giving technical support to the person running the exercise. So why have a platform and why this platform? So a lot of theories of change work by evaluation people and scenario planning, scenario exercises by futures people don't happen on platforms, but there are a good reason for having a platform, primarily because it's a means of aggregating experience around the use of a particular method. And in addition, it means the exercise that we're talking about here, we can have participants from all around the world engaging in that exercise as distinct from being in a face-to-face workshop, although this process will work in a face-to-face workshop. So many of the exercises we've run, we've had people, experts from all over the world take part. There are other Foresight platforms, but this one I think differs in a number of respects. Firstly, I think it's the only one that I know of, and I stand to be corrected, but I think there is a real, what I'd call generative theory that's informing the design of the process. That process, that tree structure, has an epistemology behind it. Secondly, it's very much about creating what I call divergent and satisficing futures rather than convergent and optimizing. So a Delphi process is about converging on something which is of common agreement. But here we don't have that convergence. We have, at the end of an exercise, we'll have the same number of storylines that we had at the beginning, but in the process, various other storylines that have branched off. Some will survive, some will die out. And the other unique feature, I think, is that this approach starts off with and focuses on narratives, and then after that gets into analysis of the contents of those narratives. Whereas I think some other approaches to scenario building start off with analysis and then generate a narrative based on that analysis. Mm. And I think the other feature is, compared to, on average, and this is a pretty broad generalization, the number of alternative futures that are generated in a PowerEvo exercise is greater than many other Foresight methods. So let me sort of move on to the next slide. I'm just talking here now about the outputs of an exercise, the immediate outputs of a PowerEvo exercise. First and foremost, there are multiple storylines describing alternative futures. in that one with the International Centre for Civil Society, there were 13 storylines and another 39 that died out on the way. And these storylines, the surviving ones were in about 1,600 words in length, and the extinct ones were anywhere between 200 and 1,400 words. So very rich, detailed descriptions of alternative futures, not simple succinct stereotypes, but quite detailed, articulated descriptions. Along with that, we've got a lot of evaluative judgments being made of these storylines. The individual contributions can be tagged with words that make assessments about the nature of the content. The individual storylines can be evaluated by the participants and others. And also there are various data sets which can be downloaded at the end, which are not only about the content, but also about the structure of participation. And very advisedly, but not part of the app itself, is the importance of group and one-to-one meetings after the process is completed. And there's more information on analytic frameworks through that link at the bottom. So what are the broad objectives as distinct from just the outputs, which are plentiful? And I think there are three broad objectives. One is cognitive objectives, which are about developing more flexible and self-aware ways of thinking about the future, which is often summarized in the term futures literacy. When people write stories about the future and look at what they've written and what other people have written, one of the things we hope will happen is people will think about how those stories have been written. What are the assumptions behind those stories? What's missing out? What's dominant? There are multiple different angles to how you can think about the future, and reflecting on those storylines is one way of being a little bit more self-consciously thinking about how you're thinking about the future. The second is about behavioral changes. And here we're talking about having a greater capacity to anticipate and respond to uncertain futures. And I'll talk a bit more about that shortly. And then on a more meta level, which applies more to me perhaps than the facilitator and the participants, is accumulating knowledge about how to make how to achieve these other two objectives through tweaking the design of the exercises and how they are delivered. I've just thrown this in as some of you might be aware of something called the futures cone. Well, this is an elaboration of it, just trying to emphasize that when you're thinking about alternative futures, particularly when they're described as narratives, alternative futures have so many different dimensions. And here I've just listed different dimensions between those which you can think about as possibilities versus those which are just not even within your frame of reference. Things which are unlikely versus likely, desirable versus undesirable, equitable, inequitable. There's so many ways you can slice the futures, and these can occur in all sorts of different combinations. And one of the ways we address this when it comes to analyzing the storylines is through some of the scatter plots which you can develop using the downloaded data. And this one here is looking at all those data points on the scatter plot. There are the different storylines in a particular exercise, and they've been plotted against two axes of desirability and likelihood. And one of the things, and you can of course plot them against other axes, for example, equity versus sustainability. Different storylines will have different values on those two axes as judged by the evaluators, the people evaluating them. But when we're looking at this sort of scatter plot, there are a couple of basic questions we can ask ourselves about whether there are some spaces in this scatter plot which are just unoccupied. We just haven't thought about them. None of the storylines have covered that territory. That's a pretty important awareness to have. Secondly, those in the scatter plot here, points which are more out on the edge will be where there's more stronger agreement, whereas those which are in the center there's more likely to be more disagreement. So the level of agreement over the attributes of these storylines in terms of which storylines are likely versus unlikely, desirable versus unlikely, those points of disagreement are fairly important to focus in on and seek ways of resolving if possible. And then we've also got questions about how to respond to these different possibilities. How you might want to respond to something which is likely and desirable could be very different to how you might want to respond to something which you think is unlikely and undesirable. And I'll come to that in the next slide. So this is just one sort of device for thinking about one combination of two dimensions, given the fact that we've got many dimensions in these stories about the future. So in terms of storylines which are desirable and likely, there, I think the question is, how does this compare to our existing plans? Can we harmonize our existing plans and theories with these, since we're both thinking they're the sort of direction we're going to? It's a sort of like fine tuning or tweaking of our theories of what we're trying to do. Whereas with something which is undesirable and unlikely, well, at the very minimum, what we might want to be doing there is just monitoring the status of those. It's like monitoring the status of a volcano which has been dormant for years, decades and decades. But at the very least, you want to actually monitor what the heck's going on with that volcano. Whereas things which are undesirable and likely, we might be thinking there more about preventing beforehand and mitigating afterwards. Whereas with things which are desirable and likely, it's more a matter of whether we can enable them beforehand and exploit them afterwards. So one of the things that I hope we can develop as we go along is for these different combinations of dimensions, try and explicate the different sort of implications for the kinds of decisions you could be making about them. Let me go on. I'll just getting towards the end now. Just want to summarize what we've done in terms of numbers of exercises today. I think we've had around about 20 exercises. Probably the first half to a third were ones which are essentially pre-tests that I was sort of running myself and trying to get people to participate in. But the second lot have all since been run by other people who've been consultants or staff members of organizations, and I've been in the background helping them run them for their own purposes. Some of the different organizations have been think tanks here in London and in Cambridge, consultancy firms, International Centre for Civil Society students, and now some PhD students who want to use them as a data collecting tool for their work. And the topics covered have been climate change, COVID, post-Trump America, biological research risks, solar radiation management, governance, international civil society developments, UN volunteer programs, UN agency gender policy, all those things that you can see on the screen there. And there's also been some work on sort of developing alternative histories, but I won't go into that at the moment. So in the pipeline, we've got three or four exercises in the pipeline. One has just been completed where an evaluation consultant did a participatory analysis of the program design. That was a rather complex exercise. And then we've got 3 PhD students, one looking at the politics of Egypt, another one looking at extreme weather events, another one looking at science communication. And we've got a UN body who's about to start a new exercise looking at intersecting global crises and ways of responding to those. And this is the slide I wanted to end up with, which is about foresight, policy and advocacy and evaluation. So if you were going to use an app like this, how might you use it? Could the alternative storylines be about how a particular advocacy strategy might work, given the fact that you might start off with a particular approach and then various things might happen, and then you can work out the implications of those various things through following different storylines? Who would be the participants that you might want in such an exercise? Could the participants, or should they, tag each contribution in terms of its desirability, likelihood, or some other attribute that might be more important? Would it be useful to have red teams that were actually doing the commenting on the participants' contributions, so they're taking a more adversarial, critical role to commenting on the developing storylines? What sort of questions would you ask if you were getting people to evaluate these storylines about how an advocacy policy worked? And what would be the range of responses that you might have to some of those alternative futures? which I've mentioned down the bottom there, but I won't go into detail at the moment. And I think I'll stop at this point, Annette, if that's okay.
Great. Thanks so much for that. Rick, you did forget to introduce yourself.
Okay.
And could you say a word or two, and I will figure out how to splice it in, because you're known to me, but not to everybody else.
Okay. My name's Rick Davies. I'm an Australian citizen, long-term resident here in the UK, in Cambridge, and I'm an evaluation consultant. I've been working largely with international development aid programs since about 1983, and mainly in the field of evaluation since the early 90s. Yeah.